talking about reverb for Loudon Stearn's Intro to Music Production class. Now, reverb is a very important factor in many different mixes because it gives a sense of space. You see, an instrument that's been recorded dry, it hasn't had any sort of reverb applied to it, sounds very sterile. It sounds like it was either recorded in a studio, or in the case of something like a MIDI track, it sounds like it wasn't really recorded in a real space at all. It just sounds like it's been played through a MIDI track. Reverb allows us to take recordings and flush them out to really give us a sense of space. It's kind of ironic that a lot of the mixing and recording process is removing the ambient unwanted sounds of the room, but then you use so many plugins to kind of put them back in. And reverb is a way to do that. But the benefit is that we can control it in just such a way that we're getting what we want. So here are the two primary reverb plugins. I'm using Logic Pro 9, by the way, but there are a ton of different audio things out there, DAWs, that have their own versions of these. This is an algorithmic reverb. Now, the reason it's called an algorithmic reverb is because when you use it, it creates your reverb based on an algorithm or a formula. This allows you to have a very, very great degree of control over exactly how your reverb works. Now, let me play you this little guitar clip I've made for reverb purposes, dry. As you can hear, it's very dry, there's no reverb, there's no real sense of what the room is like, it's just this guitar signal. Now, here are the different sort of parameters that an analog reverb will have. I'll make this a little bigger for you. This is the pre-delay. The pre-delay delays the start of the reverb a little bit, which helps really give us a sense of the size of the room, because the reverb starts when the audio signal bounces off the walls. So the longer that takes, that means the room is bigger. So it's taking the audio a longer period of time to get to your instrument, from your instrument to a wall and back. So by upping the pre-delay, I'm upping how long it will take for the reverb to start, and I'm increasing the perceived room size. Now this, of course, segues right into the direct room size parameter, which further gives that sense of the room that that the audio is being recorded in, and how big or small it is, and how slow the reverb will be. And finally, reflectivity. This sort of controls what sort of things are in the room, and how reverb sounds will reflect off the materials. So if you have curtains over the walls and it's well padded, it'll have very low reflectivity. But if you're in a room with very, hard walls like an auditorium, it'll have a very high reflectivity because the sound's going to bounce off of that. So let's hear what it sounds like sort of on the extreme end, with a high pre-delay, a big room size, and high reflectivity. You can definitely hear that there's much more of an echo now. It's very, very strong, and you definitely notice that there's a reverb now. It feels like it's been recorded in the space. So I'll bypass it one more time. And now with the reverb. You can definitely hear it echoing and trailing off a little bit. Now, the thing to remember with reverb is that you always want to work subtle. Don't be too extreme, don't use really long room delays. Optimally, the reverb will be under 2 seconds. That's primarily how you want to work with reverb. A rule of thumb is to adjust the reverb to the point where you can just barely hear it and then crank it back a little bit. Some of the best mixes with reverb are very, very subtle, and you'll barely notice them. But if you remove the reverb after that, it'll become very obvious to the listener. Now, to jump to a different type of reverb plugin, I'll bypass this, is this type of reverb plugin, which is called a convolution reverb. Convolution reverbs differ very much from algorithm reverbs because they give you a very, very sort of realistic space, because they're actually just recordings of a real space applied to your instrument. However, at the same time, you don't get quite the finesse and control that an algorithmic reverb will give you. So, for example, I can pick an IR sample, and you'll see this pop up, and it will give me a selection of spaces, large, medium, and small spaces. So I can say that I'm recording this in a large choir hall. So now it's pulled up this recording and will apply it to my sound. So here's how it will sound with this. You hear that longer bouncing? versus the bypass. Sorry, it lagged a bit. But as you can hear, it sounds much more dead with the bypass on. Now I'll switch to a different sample of a smaller room. A small space per se. I'll do jazz guitar recording room. So here's what this will sound like. Much less reverb. So to cut short and minimize this, reverb is something you want to work with. It's something that really adds some depth to a mix and makes it very realistic, but you want to be subtle. Don't have crazy reverb times because then you just sort of trudge into delay plugin territory. Try to keep it under 2 seconds of reverb. Convolution reverbs are more realistic, but less directly controlling than an algorithmic reverb. Happy reverbing!